Right. This speech is about asthma. There's nothing technical about it. It's fairly common vocabulary, and I think what I'll have to say about asthma is basic general knowledge. I will mention pollution, and in particular, I'll mention particulates. But apart from that, there's nothing technical or medical about this speech. And I'll start in a few seconds. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I remember in 2008, a colleague of mine was talking about a pandemic that was ravaging the world. And this pandemic was asthma. Now, of course, since then, we've discovered what a real pandemic is, and we probably wouldn't use the term pandemic in the same way. But what my colleague was trying to say was that suddenly there was a new awareness of asthma, and that asthma seemed to be spreading all over the world much more quickly than before. Furthermore, asthma was affecting different groups. First of all, it was affecting people at a younger age than we were accustomed to. And secondly, it was affecting developing countries, poorer countries as well, because back then one tended to assume that asthma was something that affected people who lived in rich countries and people who developed asthma when they were older. And this apparently was no longer the case because in 2007, 2008, there were a lot of statistics all over the world showing that asthma was spreading to all sorts of different countries and that more and more people were suffering from asthma. For instance, to give you an example of an emerging economy, in India, in 2008, they published statistics to say that there had been a 10% increase since the previous year in asthma. Now, of course, that could be down to the fact that the Indian authorities were better at collecting statistics, that Indian hospitals were better at treating asthma, but it could also have meant that indeed there were 10% more Indians who were developing asthma than before. There were similar statistics coming in from other big emerging economies at the time: China, Brazil, Mexico, and so on. Secondly, all over the world, in emerging countries as well as in developed countries, more and more young people were developing asthma, and more children seemed to be suffering from asthma from a very young age. Again, that could be because doctors were better at detecting the early signs of asthma in small children, and that just because we had better health checkups, we were realizing that a child might have asthma, whereas maybe 10 years before we wouldn't have noticed until it got more serious when they were teenagers. Either way, it was worth commenting upon, as my colleague did. Asthma itself has been around for a long time. We're all familiar with asthma. Asthma, to keep it very simple, is a respiratory disease. It affects your ability to breathe. If you don't breathe properly, you don't get enough oxygen in your blood. If you don't get enough oxygen in your blood, it's hard for your body to function properly. So you could have lower energy levels. People who suffer from asthma sometimes feel tired most of the time or can't do simple things like do sports, or in some cases, they can't even go up the stairs if they live in a house that has a lot of stairs. Asthma can vary greatly. There are actually people who have asthma who are able to have a very active life. Some top sportsmen have asthma because they only get asthma attacks occasionally. And if they have the right treatment, which is usually a respirator, a spray that helps them breathe properly, they can actually even be professional athletes. Other people don't become professional athletes, but again, they can probably have a normal life as long as they have their asthma inhaler to help them, or as long as they take certain medicines. For some people, it's much more serious. They're not ill in a life threatening way, but as I said, they feel tired all the time. They can't do any sport. They can have a semi normal life, but they struggle to do things like go for a walk or go up the stairs or carry their shopping. And in extreme cases, people who have very serious asthma can have regular asthma attacks. And if they're not looked after properly, they can die. Either way, as I've said, asthma has been around for a long time, and we are relatively familiar with it and with how to deal with it. As I've said, we've developed these inhalers, these little sprays that you can use, and there's lots of other more active medical ways of combating asthma. Asthma is reasonably well understood. We know that it's a respiratory problem, and it seems to be caused by certain types of allergies. And a lot of these allergies can be triggered by plants, and particularly certain flowers, certain trees, cereals also. People who have asthma sometimes suffer from it worse in springtime or around the harvest time. But there are lots of other factors involved in asthma. And again, for a long time, we've become aware of a link between asthma and pollution. Whether asthma is directly caused by pollution or whether the pollution makes us more vulnerable to developing asthma, well, it depends on which medical journals or which news items you're reading or listening to. But there's definitely a link between pollution and asthma. Having said that, some people also seem to have asthma because it's inherited, it's a family problem. But even there, it's often made worse if you live in a polluted environment. Which brings us to one of the points I made earlier about how asthma was spreading to developing countries. Basically, this was because developing countries were getting richer. And so people had more cars. People had were more likely to live in cities where there was a lot of pollution. There were factories because these countries were industrializing. So actually, people were more prosperous, and this was a good thing. But as a result, they were exposed to pollution, and therefore, what used to be a problem for rich countries had become a problem in poorer countries, and indeed a bigger problem because in poor countries, often the levels of pollution were higher. There are lots of traffic jams in all the big cities in the third world, and the cars tend to have lower environmental standards. Factories don't have environmental standards at all. So there was a lot more pollution, and this was causing more and more problems for the population. Having said that, even if you look at a modern developed country like the United States of America, in 2008, they had statistics that showed that 15 to 20% of American adults had some kind of breathing problem, which was linked to pollution. And a lot of those actually were either leading to asthma or were actually related to asthma. Another interesting thing about the way uh, asthma spread was, again, in developing countries, to do with changing lifestyles. People left the countryside and moved to cities, and they had a more urban environment, which meant that apart from the pollution, they were also living often in apartments. They weren't going out into, they didn't have a garden. They weren't going outdoors. They were living indoors with air conditioning, with fitted carpets, with sofas and chairs that were often padded with synthetic materials. Now, these synthetic textiles and other materials are often things that can lead to allergies and can make allergies that already exist worse. And air conditioning is another thing that circulates allergic particles and can make an allergy worse. And the other thing that makes these things worse is the fact that people were also developing a taste for Western type food, particularly processed food, rather than fresh vegetables and fresh meat. And apparently, this is another thing that leads to allergies and contributes to asthma. And the final thing, and this is one which amused me particularly, and that is that children were being brought up indoors and they weren't playing outside in the dirt like they used to. And furthermore, indoors, everything was very antiseptic because their parents cleaned everything. Everything was bleached. Everything was cleaned regularly. And the children were probably washed and cleaned far more regularly than I was when I was a young child. And this meant that their immune system was actually less strong than if they were playing in the dirt and getting small infections as children right from the beginning. So, in conclusion, um, I don't know what we can do about pollution, but maybe one thing we can do is allow children to go out and roll around in the dirt and have a good childish time. And personally, as a small boy who used to like rolling around in the dirt, I can tell you a small child would be very, very grateful if you just stopped cleaning them and let them get dirty occasionally. And on top of it, you might even improve their health. So that's worth thinking about. Thank you.